They say freedom is peace, the ability to stand alone, untouched by need, immune to disappointment. But behind that calm exterior, something quieter hides, a fatigue that doesn't show, a loneliness that doesn't speak. Emotional independence was meant to protect. A survival instinct turned philosophy. It began as strength. It became my identity, and then it began to hurt. There's a kind of ache that comes not from losing people, but from no longer knowing how to let them in. A silence that feels like peace, but is really disconnected. This is not a story about weakness. It's a story about the invisible weight of being too strong, the quiet suffering of those who have mastered the art of not needing anyone. This is the dark side of emotional independence. There is a strange kind of beauty in being untouchable. The way people look at someone who seems unshaken by the world, calm, composed, and entirely self-contained. They admire it. They call it strength. And perhaps, in the beginning, it truly is. To stand alone feels clean, safe, free from the trembling uncertainty of depending on others. You no longer wait for someone to call, or hope someone understands. You learn to give yourself everything you once begged for. Comfort, reassurance, calm. But somewhere along that path, the definition of peace quietly changes. It stops being about stillness and becomes about avoidance. The silence that once felt healing begins to echo differently, not like solitude, but like absence. Emotional independence, at first feels like rising above pain. You convince yourself that you've grown, that the parts of you that used to ache have matured into self-sufficiency. But what really happened was subtler. You didn't stop needing love, you just stopped expecting it. Over time, even simple gestures, a friend asking, "Are you okay?" begin to feel intrusive. You answer with a practiced smile, something that says, "Don't worry, I'm fine," because letting someone see your softness feels like exposure. And slowly the walls thicken, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. The kind that remembers how it felt when care wasn't returned, or when trust became a bruise. People call it growth. You call it peace. But deep down, it feels like distance. In quiet moments, when the world falls silent and there's no one to perform calmness for, the truth surfaces. The strength feels heavy. The silence feels sharp. You realize that what others see as resilience is sometimes just the art of disappearing, beautifully, invisibly, without complaint. Because emotional independence isn't always freedom. Sometimes it's simply the gentlest way to be alone. It rarely starts as a choice. Emotional independence, the kind that grows into silence, is often born quietly, in childhood rooms where feelings were too loud for the space they were given. Maybe it began with a parent who loved deeply but inconsistently, someone who said "I'm here," but was too tired, too broken, or too distracted to stay. Maybe it began with absence, not the dramatic kind, but the subtle one, the emotional distance of someone who was physically present, but psychologically elsewhere. A child notices. They always do. They begin to measure love by the things that go unsaid. They learn that asking too much pushes people away, that need is something to be ashamed of, and so they adapt, quietly, brilliantly. They become self-sufficient before they even understand the word. At first, it feels like survival. They learn to soothe themselves. They build invisible walls, decorating them with calmness and capability. They learn to anticipate disappointment, so it never surprises them again. But somewhere in that survival, something innocent is lost. The belief that someone will stay even when you're not strong. And this belief doesn't return easily. It hardens into personality, into identity, into pride. By the time they grow older, emotional independence has become a form of armor that no longer feels like protection. It feels like skin. The thought of letting someone care for them feels almost wrong, almost shameful, because needing becomes equal to weakness. But deep within, under layers of composure and control, there sits still that child, waiting for a gentle voice that never came. Not for rescue, but for understanding. for someone to say, "You didn't sit have to be this strong so soon." And until that voice is heard, whether from another person or from within, the cycle continues. Every attempt at connection feels like a test. Every bond feels temporary. Every "I sit and fine" is another quiet way of saying, "I learned long ago that love leaves, so I learned to leave first." The human brain is built for connection. It reads safety not in isolation, but in closeness, in faces, voices, the steady rhythm of another heartbeat nearby. But when closeness becomes unpredictable or painful, the mind adapts. It learns to find safety elsewhere, in solitude, in control, in detachment. Psychologists call this avoidant attachment. It's the quiet strategy of those who have learned that needing others is dangerous. It's not a choice, but an adaptation, the nervous system's way of protecting itself from emotional chaos. Over time, this rewiring becomes instinct. The brain begins to release calm, not when someone approaches, but when no one does. Intimacy starts to feel like threat. Distance starts to feel like home. It's why emotionally independent people often seem so grounded. They've learned to regulate their own emotions without external help. They find comfort in predictability, in self-sufficiency, in not being at the mercy of another person's inconsistency. But the same mechanisms that shield them from pain also block joy. When vulnerability is suppressed, tenderness fades. When the body no longer expects warmth, even love feels like discomfort, something too bright, too close, too unfamiliar. Neurologically, this looks like hyperactivation of self-regulation circuits and underactivation of emotional co-regulation pathways. The brain literally forgets how to rely on others for calm. And so, connection becomes a skill they must relearn, not a natural reflex. In relationships, they may appear attentive yet distant, present but not open. They love deeply but cautiously, constantly managing invisible tension. Don't sit, get too close. Don't sit, lose control. It's sits, not a lack of love. Because for them, love once meant instability, and the body remembers instability like pain. The psychology of distance is in sit about arrogance or superiority. It sits about protection. It sits the nervous system whispering, "Stay safe by staying alone." But safety and fulfillment rarely live in the same place. And the longer one stays safe, the further one drifts from what it means to truly feel alive. There comes a point when silence starts to ache. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, invisible ways. The laughter that doesn't land the same. The moments of joy that feel slightly hollow. The hug that feels undeserved. Inside the emotionally independent person lives a quiet contradiction. The longing for closeness and the fear of it. They crave connection but flinch when it arrives. They want to be understood but never fully seen. It's a life lived in between, halfway open, halfway gone. On the surface, they appear content, calm, capable, endlessly composed. But beneath that composure, there sips a fragile balance, a constant negotiation between the part that wants to reach out and the part that insists, "Don't sit." They keep people at arm's length, not because they dislike them, but because closeness feels unpredictable. Vulnerability is not just emotional exposure, it's the reopening of old wounds. So, they love carefully, they listen deeply. But when someone leans in too close, they retreat, smiling, gentle, but distant. To others, it may look like indifference, but inside, it feels like survival. The inner dialogue is relentless. They sit or leave anyway. Don't sit, depend too much. Stay calm, stay controlled. Even moments of tenderness trigger quiet panic, the kind that doesn't show on the face but races beneath the skin. A fear that if they let someone in too far, they'll lose themselves again. And yet, they yearn for the kind of safety that doesn't demand control, for the freedom to exhale in someone else's presence without pretending to be whole. This is the silent conflict, to need what terrifies you, to crave intimacy and mistake it for danger, to live in emotional solitude, not because you want to, but because somewhere along the line, it became the only way to feel safe. And that is the hidden cost of strength. The constant, quiet tension between wanting to be held and refusing to need it. It rarely happens in a grand cinematic way. Sometimes, it's just a small moment, an unexpected kindness, a touch, a sentence that reaches somewhere long forgotten, something gentle enough to slip past the defenses. It could be a friend who stays after everyone else leaves, a stranger who listens without interrupting, or someone who doesn't try to fix you, who just sits beside your silence and calls it enough. At first, you resist. You tell yourself it's nothing. You remind yourself that you don't need anyone, that this feeling, this warmth, is dangerous. But the walls tremble a little, and for a moment, you feel something that isn't fear. You feel seen. And that realization is disorienting, because all this time, independence felt like safety. But this feels like being alive. You start to notice the ways your isolation has been quietly starving you. The conversations you never had, the comfort you never allowed, the laughter you muted out of habit. You begin to see that what you called peace was in truth a truce, a lifelong negotiation between loneliness and pride. It's unsettling to admit that you've built a life around control, not connection, that the walls you thought were protecting you have also kept you untouched by love. But this is the moment of fracture, not collapse, but realization, the gentle cracking open that lets light in through the smallest fault lines. And in that light, something human stirs, the part of you that still believes in softness, in being held, in being known, the part that remembers that love, even when uncertain, is not always a wound. Sometimes it's the cure. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't suddenly drop your armor or open your arms to the world, but you start to see it, the possibility that strength could also mean surrender. And in that seeing, the walls begin to crumble, not in ruin, but in rebirth. Healing doesn't begin with a grand decision. It begins quietly, the day you stop pretending that you sit unaffected, the moment you whisper, maybe I do want someone to stay. It's uncomfortable at first, almost foreign. After years of self-reliance, leaning feels like weakness, asking feels like exposure, letting someone see your need feels like standing in the open, unarmored. But slowly, you learn that dependence isn't the opposite of strength. It's its mirror, that to trust someone is not to lose control, but to share it, that to receive care is not a failure of independence, but a return to balance. The process is slow, often clumsy. You reach out, then retreat. You try to express, then go silent again. It's a rhythm. One step forward, one back, but each time you try, the distance shortens. You begin to notice small shifts. The comfort of a friend's voice that no longer feels intrusive. The relief of admitting, today was hard. The surprising warmth of hearing someone reply, I know. Neuroscientifically, your brain starts to relearn co-regulation, the forgotten language of safety through others. The nervous system, once trained to calm only in solitude, starts finding peace in connection again. You begin to see that vulnerability isn't a threat, it's an opening, that the heart was never meant to live behind reinforced walls. It was meant to breathe in the presence of others. This stage of healing isn't about breaking independence, it's about redefining it. True independence is not the absence of need. It's the freedom to need without fear, to stand alone because you can, and to reach out because you want to. Over time, the edges soften. You stop guarding every word, every feeling. You allow care to find you, not because you're weak, but because you finally realize that strength without softness is just another kind of loneliness. And in that realization, something within exhales for the first time in years. In the end, healing doesn't look like a dramatic reunion with the world. It looks like gentleness, quiet mornings where your heart feels lighter, conversations that don't exhaust you, the rare ease of saying, I missed you. It's not about breaking your walls completely, but learning to build doors in them. You still value solitude, but now it breathes instead of suffocates. You still cherish independence, but it no longer means isolation. You begin to understand that belonging was never the opposite of freedom. It was its completion, because even the strongest hearts need somewhere to rest, and even the calmest souls crave the warmth of being known. The dark side of emotional independence was never the strength itself. It was the belief that strength required loneliness, that to be whole you had to be untouched. But true wholeness is softer. It's knowing you can stand alone yet choosing, sometimes, not to. It's being brave enough to let your voice tremble when you say what hurts. It's allowing care to reach the places you've kept untouched for too long. One day, you catch yourself laughing without restraint. You feel your shoulders drop in someone's presence. You realize you're no longer performing calmness. You're simply at peace. And maybe this is what belonging really means. Not dependence, not surrender, but the quiet understanding that we are meant to echo off each other, that the self finds its fullest shape, not in isolation, but in connection. The walls haven't disappeared. They've softened. The silence hasn't vanished. It now hums with life. And in that stillness, you finally understand. Emotional independence was never supposed to make you untouchable. It was meant to teach you how to return, whole, aware, and unafraid, to the gentle gravity of being human.